Digital 410 Productions proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts Don Abernathy and Jeff Copsetta.
Eugene Sledge came, whenever we came back off of New Britain to Pavuvu, Sledge was there, come in as a replacement, and he was assigned to my squad. And I knew that he'd had a little bit of college, but he was just a green kid like I was whenever I first got there. And I never thought too much about him, one way or the other, as far as him, where he was a good Marine or where he wasn't a good Marine. He went through all the training and everything that we went through. And then we went on into Peleliu, and whenever we hit Peleliu, Sledge always did what I told him to do or asked him to do, and never hesitated. And you can't ask much more than that of a Marine, of a guy, your buddy. And I always admired Sledge for the simple reason that the way I understood it, his dad was a medical doctor, and they were pretty well off, I think, and so they had a yard boy and they had a nanny and a cook and everything like that. And Sledge, his only responsibility was to feed his dog. And I thought the kid come out of an environment like that and come into the Marine Corps as strict as they are and as much physical training as you get and mental training. I thought he did real well. And I always admired him for that, sticking it.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II based podcast, and we are back again. We're excited to have, once again, Henry Sledge. But first and foremost, Jeff, how are you, friend? How's everything in Texas?
Couldn't be better.
Shout out, just a quick heads up, and here's the hope, and everybody in Louisiana is all right from the hurricane tonight. Being down here in Florida and someone who's lived through 6 hurricanes myself, I know even on a good hurricane, quote unquote, if there is one, long consecutive days and weeks in the hot summer without power and water, even if you don't have any property damage, still sucks and can take a toll on the family, not only financially, but it's just rough. So for all the people who were just going through that hurricane today, our thoughts are with you guys. And going without being said, our thoughts are with the family members of the 13 Marines who and the corpsmen who lost their lives in the service last Sunday. But on those notes, how are you guys doing, Henry? How are you?
Doing well. I'm happy to be here again.
Jeff, I just thought we'd pick up kind of where we left off on last week's episode. First and foremost, we'd like to talk about the fancy things behind you. That mortar, though, huh? And that's very theme appropriate for this episode.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought so.
Nice piece. So last week you're telling Henry that you would like to take the opportunity to just explain a little bit about your experiences with the HBO The Pacific and all things EB Sledge and the PTO and its affected on what you've gone through. Yeah,
so I guess first to tell that story, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the first time I saw a Band of Brothers. And it was kind of a funny thing looking back. I had one of my squad leaders. We were overseas, and one of my squad leaders was real proud that his wife had bought him the Band of Brothers box set. Now this would have been for Christmas of 2004. I'm pretty sure that's the year it came out. I mean, I don't remember hearing Band of Brothers a miniseries before we left. So I'm pretty sure that's about the time it came out. It was pretty new.
I just found out, not to interrupt you, but I just found out from reading this book we get into later, it actually premiered 2 days before 9/11.
Yes. Yep.
Really?
Yes. It premiered 2 days before 9/11, and in this book they make a reference to how the impact of what the men were going through, how it was kind of obviously not intended during production, but how that spoke to what we were going through and, as a country and the blow that we just undertook. But that's actually brought up in this book Yeah, 2 days prior to 9/11, it premiered on HBO.
Well, I was only 3 years off there.
Well, I mean, not everybody had HBO. I mean, let's be honest. So,
Well, I was in basic training. I was up at Fort Knox when September 11th happened. So maybe I was just kind of a little bit busy
yeah,
from then until March of '04 when we went across the berm to Iraq over there. But anyway, either way, we didn't have much time for movies. And so it was pretty fresh for a lot of us. And so my squad leader got this beautiful package in the mail. She spent whatever it was like $80 at the PX or whatever, and she bought it for him, mailed it over, and nobody could borrow it. And if, he had to be there, he had to be the one to put the disc in. Nobody touched it. I mean, he was real proud of it. And I think we watched it over the course of about a week, or maybe longer because, we had stuff to do. But there was a handful of us that tried to kind of tune into it, in the evening when we got done with our missions or whatever, or whenever we had downtime. And I'd never been so moved. And maybe it was the environment I watched it in. But I definitely remember the end where, I probably watched it 100 times. And it's hard to not get a little bit emotional when Major Winters talks about, that very last scene where he's kind of signing off with the conversation with his grandson. And I just kind of remember looking around the room with these guys that I saw every day that I couldn't stand being around kind of thing, but you're fighting next to them. It kind of dawned on me then that maybe one day I'll look back and see these guys that same way. We were 18, 19, 20 years old, or I'd turned 21 over there, but I guess it kind of made me see everything a little bit different. And so that was kind of my introduction with that miniseries. So naturally, and of course, growing up, I was a huge fan of the Mighty Eighth, reading about it, P-17s, that was my thing, Memphis Belle. But there was always kind of a soft spot. There was kind of this weird enigma about the Pacific that as a boy, it was just so hard to grasp the tiny little specks that were the islands that we invaded and the vastness of, what these fleet carriers were responsible for with Dauntlesses and Hellcats. And it was overwhelming to me as a kid. And the model airplanes, for example, finding that right model airplane to build for the Pacific. And I still do that kind of stuff. But I don't know, there was something about it. There was something different about the environment in the Pacific than there was to me for the boys over in Europe. And I don't know what it is. They're just, I don't know. I can't explain it. It was grittier, maybe. I don't know. I wasn't there. There was just something about it. So when I picked up a book, I'm always reading. Don knows this, always reading. And I think it was 2012, 2013, somewhere in there. And I'm not exactly sure when the Pacific debuted. I don't know when that debuted. What was that, sir?
2010.
Okay, well, I certainly didn't see it when it was new because I do remember, I'm pretty sure my daughter was born, and she was born in 11. But anyway, I got a real bad case of pneumonia. I was hospitalized with pneumonia. I was physically picked up out of my bed and taken to the emergency room. And I remember being told in the emergency room, "Oh, I hope you have some, time to take because you're going to be sick for a while." And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm going down to the coast tomorrow morning." And they're like, "Yeah, no, you're not." Like, yeah, actually.
Little did you know, you'll be like Chuckler on Pavuvu.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the next day, I drove the wife and kids, and we took my mom down to a cabin on Copano Bay down there in Fulton, down by Port Aransas, and spent the week down there. And I just distinctly remember that trip because I was reading Hugh Ambrose's The Pacific. I was reading that book, and I didn't have HBO. I've never had HBO, so maybe that's why the miniseries passed me up. I probably didn't even have a smartphone then, so I probably had no way to see it. But I do remember after reading that book and hearing about it, oh my gosh, if this is anything like Band of Brothers, I can't wait. finally, this is what I want to see. And we kind of talked about it in that last episode. I was really looking forward to the character, the Dauntless pilot in Midway. I've always wanted to feel like I'm in a Dauntless and a 70-degree dive, and this cinematic, beautiful masterpiece, and just, and I think the Midway film, recently came pretty close to what I was looking for then. But of course, now we
liked it.
What's that, sir?
I liked the 2019 Midway movie.
I really,
but not to get you off track.
yeah, I can talk about that one all day. But anyway, so I finally got to see it, and I'll be honest, I didn't like it at first, and I think maybe because I expected more of the Band of Brothers, even though I knew the characters in the book and I knew they weren't in the same unit, but it was really kind of confusing to watch at first. And even my wife was kind of the same way, and we've talked about this in previous episodes where around wintertime, my wife and I, we sit down, we watch Band of Brothers. It happens every year.
Yep.
That's going to happen.
Cool, crisp autumn nights. You got to have Saving Private Ryan and then work into Band of Brothers. And as it gets colder toward Christmas, it's Bastogne.
See, I live in Florida. It's hot all the time. I heard
you guys talk about that on an earlier episode, and I'm like, man, these guys are talking my language. I'm the same way. Something about a cool September, October night. I want to be watching Saving Private Ryan. You get on into the colder weather, man. It's time to go to Bastogne.
Real quick, Henry, I tried to get in your camp. I went on 2 days ago, looked for a Thin Red Line, see if I can find it anywhere. I could have got it off Amazon for $3.99, but I refused to pay for it. So if there was a free version, I was going to rewatch it and give you a new, acquired opinion on the movie, because it's been probably 15 years since I've seen it. If the damn thing would have been free, I just could not bring myself, based on my original opinion, to pay the $3 for it.
I sat down and watched it Friday night, okay, and I don't want to. Jeff's on a channel.
Sure.
Here, and I don't want to get him off, but go ahead, Jeff. I mean, we could go on about that.
Yeah, we could go on, but I'm saying all that for if there was anybody that's listening or anybody that's watching it right now, if they watch it the first time and they didn't like it for some of those similar reasons, watch it again, because you just can't go into that miniseries with the same mindset that you do Band of Brothers. It's totally different. And once you understand that, once you kind of mentally prepare for what you're about to witness, and it takes a couple times, there were some character development flaws, I thought, in some of the minor characters. I do remember the first time seeing it. I'll give you an example, and I can't think of the guy's name, but it's the guy that Lecky sees in jail on, was it Pavuvu or whatever?
It's
interesting.
interesting.
The guy who shot the dude on Cape Gloucester.
He
choked the guy.
Yeah, he choked the guy, and it's interesting
Yes.
you said that. I think it's Douglas, something like that.
I remember the character.
I have notes on that. Go ahead, Jeff, because I think I know where you're going. And when Henry and I got to talking, I went back and rewatched it. And when I first watched the series, I thought that character, and no disregard to the actor, but the way the character was presented, he was such a he was like a nobody until that episode. You're like, who's this guy again? And It wasn't until like my 17th rewatching last week that I see that
you see him everywhere.
You see, and not only that, but you hear where, like, in post-production, they'll put his name in there, almost as if they realized when they got to the end that, oh shit, this guy wasn't around enough that it meant as much as it should have. And I actually had that in my notes for last week, but go ahead, I'll look at his name.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're really getting picky there, but it is fabulous. And, I grew up about an hour from Raritan, New Jersey. The home of John Basilone. And, I've been to that statue a couple times. He's really something. In fact, the first time I went to Raritan was in October timeframe. And apparently I was there either a week prior or a week after they have John Basilone Day. And I guess, is it John Cera, the actor?
Yeah.
From the
Seda.
Oh, Seda, yeah. He goes there apparently every year dressed as Basilone for the parade.
Really?
I news to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole Basselin family's still there. It's a beautiful little town in Raritan, New Jersey. It's got the Raritan River runs right through it. I mean, you can kind of feel the colonial times around it.
Right.
You know, it's just kind of one of those little nooks of a town that kind of never really grew up. And it's really at an indescript traffic circle kind of thing where the statue is. It's not like it's downtown by, the courthouse or anything. It's just kind of there. But, and there's like it's either a stop sign or traffic light, whatever, but people stop there. And when I was there, everybody that stopped there, they rolled their windows down, and it was cold. They rolled their windows down like, that's our boy, that's Johnny, that's our man, it's hometown hero. Great, and I think probably, my opinion, the Pacific miniseries may have something to do with that. Yeah, they knew he was there. They saw the statue, but I'm curious. I have a feeling that exposure kind of reopened that stuff, and that's the biggest thing to me with the Pacific. They really, I think they shed a lot of light on the Pacific campaign in general, because let's face it, when you crack open a history book, it's Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, atom bomb. That's the Pacific.
Pretty much.
In the history books today.
And
nobody's heard of it.
And we see that when regular non-World War II people find out the D-Day was a generic term used for the beginning of every single operation, not just Normandy, France. People just assume D-Day. And I get it, but to your point, people who don't research it, the Pacific and the Band of Brothers both did a fantastic job on making people who deserve accolades finally get those accolades and knowledge. And the other thing too about the Pacific and the John Basilone stuff, it kind of goes to show you how things have changed substantially. I'm 43. I still feel like a young fella. I know, Jeff, you're in your late 30s? Mm-hmm. Lena was 33 when she became a widow. Mm-hmm. Never remarried. To me, that's astonishing. She was so young, had so much of her life, and she was just like, that's it. I'm going to be Mrs. Basilone the rest of my life, and I'm going to mourn the rest of my life. And to me, that just, and itself kind of seems a little tragic, but it also says something about love and family, at least in that time. But it's like, damn, she's only 33. Now, when I'm 23, oh wow, she was, she was old. But now I'm 40. Like, fuck, she was only 33, and that was it for her. And that just seems so tragic.
Jeff, to your point, I mean, again, going back to conversations with Bruce McKenna. Okay, Bruce was one of the main creators of Band of Brothers. He was instrumental with the Pacific, as I believe I went into some last week. But he knew how much I loved Band of Brothers, and he told me, he said, "Now, Henry, I'm telling you, this thing's going to be different." And to not repeat what I might have said last week, one of the consultants for HBO on the Pacific was Richard Frank, who, Rich Frank is a very well-known PTO historian. He wrote, I think, the definitive book on Guadalcanal.
I've met him several times.
Okay. Yeah. Rich is a good friend of mine. He was a good friend of my dad's. I got to be really good friends with him during, 2009, 2010 when the Pacific was coming out. And I remember he and I talked on the phone several times, really, but one of our conversations before it premiered, he said, in Band of Brothers, you saw like the scope that they presented of Army operations. You saw majors and colonels and lieutenant colonels and generals. You saw kind of that whole rubric of command structure. And he said the Pacific is underneath the rim of the helmet. It is that individual perspective. And so that's why they explored things like my dad being haunted so much by his experience. And Robert Leckie. I mean, he had a harrowing time of it himself. I mean, and the Pacific explored that more than Band of Brothers did. Now, with 3 separate characters and 3 separate storylines, I read all the reviews. I read what people were saying because I was primed. I wanted to know what people thought because I wanted so desperately for people to like it. I wanted desperately to like it. But again, even though I had had been coached on what to not compare it to. I still compared it to Band of Brothers. How could you not? And so I'll be honest, and I told you guys this, I watched it when it came out, my wife and I did. And of course, I was so close to the story. There were things, like the damn thing with the 45 and all. Well, and there were other things. And I'm just like, why did they do this? Why did they do that? And I was really angry at first. And roll on a number of years to basically, now. And it's fortuitous the way things work out. But I've gotten involved in a couple of projects that have shown me that the Pacific had legs. It has legs. It stands up. I mean, and I think the people who are going to care about this kind of thing and who go back to Band of Brothers, go back to the Pacific, they have an awareness that, okay, these were two completely different projects. Okay. The goals of the Pacific were different from Band of Brothers. I was reading some random reviews on the internet, and one guy, just some nameless, faceless person who watched both and was addressing which one was better. And Jeff, he's probably around your age, just guessing from what he said. But he said, I grew up watching Band of Brothers, and then I watched the Pacific, and I went in the military. And I don't know where he served or anything, but he said, I went into the military expecting it to be like Band of Brothers. I came out of it realizing it was more like the Pacific. And that was kind of heavy, because what he was saying was, sure, I mean, there's the camaraderie and all that, but I mean, there's a lot of dark mental stuff that can happen to individuals too. And let me just say right off the bat, I was never in the military. Okay. So I can only imagine what people who were and had to be overseas, what they deal with. But certainly growing up, seeing my dad and how he wrestled with the demons that he wrestled with, and successfully, and conquered them. I saw the iron will and self-discipline that he had to have to not let all that get on top of him. But suffice it to say that, after, here a couple of weeks ago, sitting down and saying, okay, guys, I still had the box set that they gave me out in Hollywood, still wrapped up in plastic. I hadn't even, other than when I watched it on HBO, I hadn't even opened that thing. So I cut the plastic off of it and sat down and said, okay, I'm going to introductions, interview, the whole bit. I'm going to take in the entire experience. And I watched it not once, but twice. And I completely reassessed my opinion of it. Now, look, you can't be as close to that story as I was and not wish they'd done certain things differently. But overall, I just completely reassessed my opinion of it.
And I think the producers of that show, they were kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation.
Yes.
Because if it would have been like Band of Brothers, then, it's just Band of Brothers light.
Yeah.
And so they were kind of in a position where, one, it's a completely different environment. Once again, for what, not only were they fighting against the Japanese, but they're fighting against the environment. But in the world of Hollywood and production and all that, they were in a sticky situation because like I just said, if they would have been too much like Band of Brothers, that would have been the criticism. And then they made it not like Band of Brothers, and for some people that was the criticism.
That was the criticism. Yep.
Now I liked it because, as I said last week, I had read your father's book before they even announced the show, and so I went into it just stacked and ready to go because I was probably 8 months off of reading your dad's book. I actually think I read it twice. So I read it once, made the decree they need to make this into a miniseries, and when I found out they did or were working on it, I read it again. And so when his scenes came up, I was like, oh, I knew what was happening. And the scene with the entrenching tool and the Marine was having the nightmares, and I'm sure in real life it was a snafu, but when they had snafu throwing the rock into the skull of the Jap machine gunner and all that, it was like I was in. More importantly, the scene where your father's on Okinawa and he slides into the foxhole with the dead Marine. People don't realize the importance of that scene if you haven't read the book, because in the book, that Marine's body was a timepiece, a literal timepiece. Your father referred to it. He saw it the day that the Marine died. He saw it 3 days later. And every time he was going back from going out on front lines or doing the duties that he was made to do back to his foxhole, he was using the decomposition of that body as a timeline for how long he had been there, and then to end up sliding down there, and he goes into great detail talking about how the soil and the maggots and all that stuff. Yep. And so that scene itself was kind of like just kind of thrown in there. I wish they would have put a little bit more of the timeline in, but once again they had to push that down into one episode, whereas Peleliu they did 2 episodes. But for me, I enjoyed it because I knew the subject matter was completely different, because I was already off the book twice before I even sat down and watched the initial viewing of it. So I greatly appreciate it. But I can understand how, I've had this conversation multiple times with different people, and it is interesting, and I think this is a good challenge for those watching or listening to this podcast who maybe were in both you and Jeff's camp, and maybe my camp with a Thin Red Line. I may go back and like it, but give it a second watch, a third watch. I think you'll definitely come around. And speaking of Band of Brothers, we didn't get to this last week. You were getting ready to participate in another podcast. If you want to give us a little plug on that and send people that way, it's a very cool project, and I'm stoked for you on this. This is very exciting.
So there is a project called We Happy Few 506. It involves 2 buddies of mine in the UK named Leighton Hughes, and then an actor from Band of Brothers who played Floyd Talbot. His name is Matthew Leach. They have gotten together, and I don't know when they started this, but they started doing live Zoom watch-along chat events following Band of Brothers, and they would involve different actors, writers, creators, producers, just anybody from the entire Band of Brothers camp that they could get involved, and some family members. And it would just be a very nominal ticket price, but people would get a ticket, watch this thing, see these people come together, watch the particular episode. Sorry, we're getting some local alerts here.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But it's garnered quite a following. Well, so after they did some of this, they were also fans of the Pacific. They said, well, hey, let's do something and cross over and cover the Pacific. And so they reached out to me, and probably it's been several weeks ago now, maybe a month ago. And we had a couple of initial conversations, and I don't want to give away any names of actors who are getting on board, but man, it's like a train coming through town, and people are just jumping on it. And they're going to be writers, people who are producing, directing, like I said, some of the actors. It's the people are jumping on board. So I think the first event for the Pacific will be September 4th.
Okay.
But for right now, I guess they're going to have information on the We Happy Few 506 website. That may splinter off and be its own thing at some point for the Pacific. But as of right now, anybody wanting information on that could go to We Happy Few 506.
And as always, we always incorporate any relevant links like that on the WTSPWorldWar2.com. So if you're watching this video or you're listening in your car, once it goes live tomorrow, obviously you don't have to worry about jotting it down. Just whenever you get home or pulled over, whatever, just get out your phone or on your computer. Just go to WTSPWorldWar2.com. On the homepage, you'll see the link for this episode. Go there, and there will be links to that website and any other content we talk about. We do have a mail call coming up, but before we get to that mail call, since we're kind of on the subject of Band of Brothers, Jeff and I, we've had some authors on in the past, and a lot of times in the past, I would have an author on after I read a book, and Jeff's gone after some authors after he's read some books. And so when we suggest a book to you, it's because, we've read the damn thing. We think it's a great book, and we want to share it. Well, Hang Tough, which we had the author on, this is a little different because, Jared had been on our podcast, I think 3 times before, because not only is he a reenactor, he's a historian, and he's just a great guy. His knowledge base is insane. And so when Jared was talking about this book on his Facebook page, and give credit to his co-authors, Eric Dorr. So this is Eric Dorr and Jared Frederick. We had him on talking about this book. This is Hang Tough. the World War II letters and artifacts of Major Dick Winters. And what separates this book between any other Band of Brothers book you've read, 93% of this book is transcripts of letters that Dick wrote to a woman that he met in basic training, in officer training school named Dieta. And so basically after Band of Brothers came out, Dieta's daughter contacted him and said, "Are you Dick Winters?" And he's like, "Yeah." She called him home. "Band of Brothers, Dick Winters?" "Yes, I am." "Do you know Dieta so-and-so?" "Yes." "I haven't talked to her since." "Well, I have every single letter that you sent to my mother during your communications." And she sent him a photo album with every letter, to which him and his wife, much like your father and your mom, Henry, sat down and painstakingly typed out. And not only typed out multiple copies for all the kids in the family, in both families, and kept the originals for themselves. Well, when Eric and Jared got access to this stuff, and they're looking through all the Dick Winters estates material, they came across these letters, and they're like, boom, there's our book. If you want an insight on this guy, read this book. The letters, you feel you're reading his own personal writing, his own vernacular, his own thoughts. And I'm in the book now. I just started a few days ago because I just finished China Marine. I'm at the point now where he just did the D-Day landings, but just what was going on in his mind through officer training school and going home before. This is a fantastic book, and I strongly suggest you guys. I got this one on Amazon. If you're a fan of Band of Brothers or Dick Winters, but you want an insight into the mind and thought process of Dick Winters, this book is just amazing. I can't put the damn thing down. I was reading it for like 2 hours before I took a nap before the podcast today. So I strongly suggest going out and getting this book, because, it's one thing to read other authors, and Jared and Eric do a great job filling in the gaps in between letters, but just reading their own words, it's just mind-blowing, because you feel like you're having a conversation with the guy. It's just a crazy thing real quick, because we got to get ready to take our break. I'm kind of into fitness. I do OCR training. I go running all the time. I lost 40, 50 pounds a few years back. Dieta is writing to Dick Winters about his diet and his fitness regimen, because as you guys seen from the photos, the guy was built. He was in great physical shape. The fact that he's telling her things that fitness people talk about now, which is there is no secret. It's all about diet, exercise, watch out for your carbs, eat more proteins. This guy was telling her things back in 1942, the honest truth about fitness and diet, and not calling it a diet. It's a lifestyle change that, fitness people are trying to get out there now to squash down all the lies about the magic pill, about the slim fast and all that. And it's like, there's no secret. He was talking about it in 1942, and yet we're still wondering what the magic secret is. And so it's so amazing how things even back then, a lot of it is true to today, and the things they talk about, it's just, I cannot suggest this book enough. So I highly recommend you guys go out and get Hang Tough, the World War II letters and artifacts of Major Dick Winters. And I actually sent Jeff a photo, and it may have been published before, but I don't remember seeing it. They actually have a photo of the court-martial papers between Sobel and Dick Winters in here, and they have a bunch of previously unpublished photos. There's a photo of Winters like laying out on his beach towel, like all modeling it up, and it's just like weird just to see him and Dieta out horseback riding, and the fact that he would just wear his pants and his leggings around town when he was home on vacation. If you really want to get to know Dick Winters, get that book. Whew. Got that out of the way, but go ahead, Jeff.
Speaking of books, real quick, I just wanted to say that I think the first book I ever read about World War II, I want to say I was either 11 or 12 years old. I was young, middle school age, was Richard Chagaskis's Guadalcanal Diary.
I have it right here.
And I want to say that's the first one, and I probably read a couple hundred, 400 or 500 books on World War II since then. But I want to share this with Henry. My 15-year-old son is reading your dad's book right now.
Oh, cool.
And I'm blessed to have a son that he fits in as much as he needs to at school, but he doesn't fit in, in a lot of ways,
Sure.
in good ways.
Yeah, I get it. I know where you're going with this.
Yeah, and I just want to say, if anybody's listening that has any kind of authority or clout or anything in the movie business. Could y'all keep the the wall banging sex out of these miniseries, please?
Hmm.
Well, it
The
is.
language these kids, they hear it on the school bus, so I get it. But man, I've said this before on other videos and stuff that I've done on YouTube about this. I just, if I had one complaint, if I could ever meet Mr. Hanks or Mr. Spielberg, and it sounds like to me, I think I'd probably enjoy more time speaking with Mr. McKenna than probably those other two. But if you go back in some of those older movies like Battle of the Bulge, you could tear that movie
Yeah.
apart because look at those Tiger tanks / M47s or whatever they were,
Yeah.
American tanks. Who cares? Who cares? Because I grew up watching it as a little kid. My son grew up watching it as a little kid, and it doesn't have to be 100% accurate for people. Just to whet your appetite, you do the research. That's not, movies are meant to entertain. They're not documentaries for a reason.
That's right.
So as long as you expose, like, oh, Pearl Harbor, oh, they had to put romance and this and that. Yeah, they had to put romance, so you can take your girl to the freaking movie theater and she'll actually pay attention for part of it.
Yeah.
That's what it's about, or it's just a bunch of dudes watching Pearl Harbor together. Like, oh, this is cool. All right, you have to do that, but it exposes them to it, and for good or for bad. And we can complain about movies like Pearl Harbor all we want, but it's great reference material for women like my wife. They're like, I need that nurse's outfit. Where did they get that stuff for the movie? Things like that. But yeah, if they could just keep the other crap out of it, man. I want my kids to see this. I mean, my son grew up on the edited for TV version of Saving Private Ryan. I mean, we'd watch it a couple times a year. He loved that movie.
Yeah.
But anyway, well, that's my.
On that note, Jeff, my son's 13. Okay. And I have only just this year started to peel the curtain back. He's always known that his grandfather, he's always known about Whip the Old Breed. I mean, that's just part of the DNA. There's no way he can't know about it. But I've started to peel the curtain back on the Pacific. There's a lot of it I haven't let him see. A lot of that Okinawa stuff is just, my God, it's disturbing, But the Peleliu landing, the Peleliu attacking across the airfield, I've let him watch that stuff, and F-bombs and all. And I mean, here's the thing. I mean, I could hear another parent say that and think, man, that's a bad call. But our son he's got a good head on his shoulders, and he and I talking. I'm like, Jack, I'm letting you watch this because it's telling a valuable story, but I don't approve of the language. Don't want you using it. You're hearing it enough at school,
Right.
But I get where you're coming from, Jeff. I mean, I'm just glad that he's showing some interest in it.
I don't want to cut you guys off. We're down at the bottom of the countdown clock. So for you guys watching at home, hold tight. We'll be right back, and we'll finish up with second half of part 2. We'll be right back.
small local.
And we are back. And thank you guys for that quick little interlude. Hey, there's Jeff. He's sneaking on the screen. You know, Jeff, before we went to break, I just kind of want to say, as far as what the things we're talking about the sex and all that, that's kind of like the default template for HBO programs. You go back like to the early days when they were kind of making a name for themselves as far as exclusive content. It's almost like that's how they get people to come over. Hey, what separates us from TV shows is we can show nudity and high profanity. And so it almost seems like every single HBO series, you're going to see at least one topless woman at some point. And so it just seems to be part of the generic template. But I understand definitely what you're getting at there, especially when you want to share it with your kids. And maybe it'll be an episode for the OG5 podcast because the content really doesn't fit well here. Carrie and I were just having that conversation earlier. We saw a new commercial for the new release of Cinderella, and it being 2021. The fairy godmother is, well, yeah, not a woman. So
yeah, of course.
They had to change things up. So he's still going by the name Fairy, but yeah. So take that for what it is. So, and we're talking about like, what if you're that's fine and all, but what if you're a Christian-based fan? Well, then you go and you watch the 70-year-old version of the cartoon and not the live-action one. But anyhow, I digress. Mail call time. Ooh, yeah, hold on. I actually did some production on this a little earlier. Oh, I thought I did. Oh, look at that. Yep. See, this is why I need a producer, so then they can hit all the buttons in the background. Oh, yeah, I did. We asked you guys last week to send us some emails, some questions for Mr. Sledge, and you followed through. And so we do have a stack of emails and questions and a pretty deep conversation about the HPT cap. Maybe we'll save for another episode. Let's see here. Jonathan from Facebook says, the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. I did not jot down your email, so I hope you'll take it here. Mr. Sledge, what is the most important thing or things you want people to know about your father and remember him for that we do not know? And you spoke of your mother, same question as well. Thank you, sir.
What I would say in response to that would be that what people don't know, and having watched the Ken Burns 2007, The War, and then The Pacific, they see a guy who, as we have discussed, was really haunted by some terrible things that he went through in the war. What nobody would ever really know, and only I could share with them, was that the real Eugene Sledge, that all that was true, okay, as it was for a lot of young men who came home. But man, Eugene Sledge had a sense of humor that few people could imagine. I mean, I knew, he was a college professor for his entire career, and I knew a lot of people who had him for a teacher or a professor. And I can remember people telling me, man, your dad is freaking hilarious. I mean, he keeps us in stitches. Now, he dropped the hammer on him. He dropped the proverbial sledgehammer on him academically. He was known for being extremely tough. But he had a great, highly defined and well-honed sense of humor. And, I think he had iron will and determination. I mean, the demons that he wrestled with he conquered them. And we had a happy family growing up. And he always encouraged my brother and me to read on our own, which we both have done always. With me, it's mostly World War II books. But my father encouraged that. He great sense of humor, iron will and determination. And those are things that maybe it was hard to convey, through the miniseries. And I'm not saying that they failed to. It's just it really maybe wasn't. Actually, I will say that there were intentions early on. They wanted to do a scene where, like, the Sledge character gets in the shower. He goes in to take a shower. They do like a fog over the lens. He gets out of the shower, 40 years later as a grown family man. And somehow they were going to work that in with being a professor and the fact that he wrote a book that was pretty famous. And I remember them telling us, well, we shot it and it just didn't work. We decided to not do it. But anyway, I hope I've answered the gentleman's question.
The first half, and I have a follow up about his question about your mom. But real quick, you and I discussed this, I think, probably off the air, and Jeff and I have talked about it on air. When it comes to these miniseries, they have so many episodes to get so many messages across, and obviously sometimes they take broad stroke feelings or thoughts that they want to convey and append it to a character. But one of the things that kind of, especially after reading China Marine, I don't want to say a disservice, but a kind of a misdirection. As far as at least I can make out from China Marine, your father did not have a disdain for the Marine Corps uniform, as in the Pacific. Oh, I'll never put on that uniform ever again. No, he loved the uniform. In China Marine, he went out of his way to explain how the Marine Corps dress greens were finer uniform than the Army's Class A uniforms, and how when he got home, a lot of people don't realize this. These guys have been gone 2, 3, 4 years. They're bigger. They're taller. A lot of their old clothes didn't fit them. And even though the economy was bouncing back, you have all these guys going home. You know how hard it is to find Uncrustables at the grocery store now that kids are going back to school. Imagine millions of young men coming home trying to find clothes. Your father said he wore his uniform for quite a long time until he had the ability to rebuild his wardrobe.
I don't know, and there's a picture I want to grab if I can step away for just a second. But you make a good point. I mean, when he said no, I'll never wear that uniform again, that had nothing to do. And I'm not saying anybody inferred this, but that in no way was a recrimination of having been a Marine, being in the Marine Corps. I can tell you this. I mean, all his life, on the leather belt that his everyday belt. Mm-hmm. My dad had an EGA on that belt. When he was a middle-aged college professor and I was a little kid and I would go over to the campus to go in his office and visit him, you'd walk in his office and it had this, institutional metal filing cabinet, right? Every office had one. And on the end of his, there was a maroon sticker. And I just remember this from early childhood. That sticker was, "When you're the finest, it's hard to be humble, United States Marines." And, and of course, in the 70s, think about who a lot of his students were. Mm-hmm. Young guys coming home from Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And they found a common ground with him, having been a combat Marine from World War II, that they didn't find with a lot of their other professors. And I got to know some really cool guys, when I was 8, 9 years old that had been in Vietnam, and in some cases had been through some heavy stuff. And they found something with my dad that they couldn't find with very many other people around the college campus.
Yeah, especially during the political views of the war at that time. I mean, being on a college campus and the way a lot of his professors lean, I'm sure they saw your father's class as kind of being a sanctuary almost, because they can get away from those boisterous, loud feelings that people were happily sharing back then about how they felt about people who fought in combat. So I'm sure, your father probably didn't have to say anything. Just being in that room and not hearing the crap that they probably hear 18 hours a day was just a nice sanctuary.
Certainly.
Real quick, part 2 of his thing, and I wanted to ask you this last week. He asked, and he spoke of your mother, same question as well. Did your mother? What did she do during this time? Did she? What was her life like? While obviously she didn't know your father at the time, but during World War II, what was things
during
like for her?
World War II, well, my mother, I've seen pictures of her when she was a young lady, and she was quite attractive. She was in Mobile. She came from a large family, several brothers and one sister and several brothers. But, she didn't meet my dad until 1951, 52. But she was originally from Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Fort Walton, Florida. But she, grew up in Mobile, and still very much in formative years for her during the World War II time.
You mentioned you want to step away and present something. So if you want to do that now, I'll just get the promos out of the way. And so while you do that, I'll just fill some space. As always, this episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast is brought to you by our friends at Computers. Computers has been providing IT solutions for all of Southwest Florida since 2004 and the rest of the world, well, since probably about 2008. So even if you don't live in Southwest Florida and you have some computer issues, as long as your internet works, of course, they can help you. So give them a call at 239-283-1120. They'll send you to their website and log in your computer and assist you with your computer needs remotely. And if you do live in Southwest Florida, give them a call at 239-283-1120. And they can help you with desktop repair, laptop repair, screen replacements, camera installation, anything technical related, network expansion, Wi-Fi footprint expansions, anything of that nature. Give them a call at 239-283-1120. And as always, please head over to what'sthescuttlebutt.com or WTSPWorldWar2.com. Easier to remember unless you're me making up a brochure for this episode. Then you put in WTSP World War I, but that's another story for another time. Jeff texted me, why did you delete the banner? Because I'm dumb and I misspelled it. And Photoshop doesn't have spell check. But anyhow, I promptly fixed it. But yeah, head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com. If you're on your cell phone, I think you may have to scroll down a little bit on the new site. Click on that Patreon link, sign up. It's $1 a month, and that will go a long way. Who knows? Maybe it'll even help us sort out our Zoom issues. And as always, if you want one of those sweet-ass shirts like Jeff's wearing, or you can't see mine because of the microphone, I actually have the old school WTSP with the camouflage Marine Corps helmet. You can pick these up over at our website. Use the promo code ILISTEN, and it'll basically cover your shipping cost. And that'll go to help. That's not so much to help us monetarily, but more to get the word out, because word of mouth is huge. We won't go down to the trials and tribulations of Facebook not sharing our posts. That's another story for another time. But if you want to help get the word out, head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com. You can get the shirt Jeff's wearing. My personal favorite shirts, which I still got to do the breakfast. I love the K-Ration shirts. We got the supper and the lunch shirts. We got all kinds of shirts. So head over there and pick those up. And Henry is back. He's got another surprise for us. I was so excited to, I almost asked you, hey, can you open up your dad's haversack so I can see what your Boyd's written on the front of that? Because I'm such a dork. But what do you have to present us this week?
Well, I'm just trying to throw a few things out there that you're not going to see from the miniseries. You mentioned pictures coming back or from not long after the war. Mm-hmm. If you can see that.
Yep.
That's my dad, not long after the war, just walking down the street in downtown Mobile.
Yep.
But that's just a quick shot there. This is just a quick photo of my grandfather, who had been a surgeon in World War I. Now, he was stateside, but he dealt with a lot of, now we would call them PTSD cases, but, they called it shell shock back then. But my grandfather with my dad and his brother, my Uncle Edward, who was a tank commander in 2nd Armored and was in Battle of the Bulge, by the way.
What was his rank? Because I was watching the last episode, and it looked like he almost had...
He was a major at the end of the war.
He had major...
He had a hell of a story. I mean, my Uncle Edward was quite the hero. He had a Bronze Star, a Silver Star, and 3 Purple Hearts.
Now, I just shuffled the deck real quick because you're talking about your grandfather, and one of our emails from a Keegan says, hey, Henry, loved last week's episode. Loved last week's episode. I guess this question may be a little out there, but he just, I guess, finished reading China Marine as well. And he was referring to how your grandfather was so insightful, because he was telling your dad shortly after the hunting trip, and your dad's struggling to find his way in the world. He told him, go be a biologist, be a PhD, but do not be a medical doctor, because, well, the government's intervention of socializing medicine, that it's going to deter doctors and patients alike. And Keegan was saying to him that was so insightful, that your grandfather was so many years ahead and seeing which way the wind was blowing in that topic.
Was he developing that into a question, or was he just
more of a statement, I guess?
My grandfather, I mean, I didn't know him. He died, I think, in 1953, 54, I believe. But my dad always felt like my grandfather was what kept him grounded, and really helped him keep his head on straight when he came home. And I think the dynamic that they showed in the miniseries was pretty, I think it was pretty spot on. I can remember my dad telling me about how, my grandmother was pretty strong-willed, and I mean, she sometimes didn't know when to stay out of certain situations, and she would really have a lot to say about my dad when he was just sitting around, kind of, just trying to recuperate psychologically. And I remember my dad telling me that Pop was what we always call my grandfather, or what they call him. And he said, Pop would just come in and lay into her and just say, "Mary Frank, leave that boy alone. You have no idea what men like him had been through." I mean, the scene they filmed in the miniseries was spot on, was as far as that goes with my grandfather and my grandmother. But yeah, he was a very smart man. He had been a major in World War One. Like I said, he was stateside, but he had been a doctor, had treated shell shock cases. They even had at their home in Mobile, which was a place called Georgia Cottage, and that's the house at the end of a very long driveway. I don't know how well you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
That's on Spring Hill Avenue. Now, my grandmother sold that house in, I think, 1975. But before my dad shipped out, when he was still like 17, 18 years old, they would have wounded soldiers and service people come out to the house and stay to convalesce.
Wow.
I've even got a picture somewhere of one of them had his wedding at their house. And there's a picture of this young, looks like an army officer with his bride, whole wedding party in my grandmother's, front living room, or parlor as they called it. And, my dad's in the corner of the picture. He just looks like a 17-year-old high school kid. But, yeah, my grandfather was quite a guy. One of the great regrets of my life was never having known him.
Yeah. Next email comes from Mr. Galen Wagner, who's been on the show once or twice. And as we said last episode, we owe everything to Galen for hooking us up, because Galen is the one who texted me at an early hour in the morning asking if I was interested in having you on. Absolutely. He said, "I would like to know if Henry knows about Sledgehammer's time at the Marion Military Institute. Did his dad talk about it at all? Did he believe that his time there had an impact on his life moving forward? Thanks a lot, Galen Wagner."
That's a really good question. I wanted to be prepared to give the best answer I could to any potential questions. So to answer Galen's question, yes, he did talk about Marion Military Institute. I think he thought very highly of the institution and of his time there. We actually have a picture somewhere around here of him in his uniform when he was at MMI. Think he saw those as good years. I would have to talk to my mother, and I actually went over and saw her today, and we watched last week's episode on her iPad because she wanted to see it.
That's awesome.
She could probably give better insight on that, because I know he went to MMI. It's in his book, and in fact, I remember when they were filming the miniseries, they had reached out to Marion, and they thought they might do, some kind of tie-in there. They ended up not doing it. But yeah, I mean, he spoke of Marion many times when I was growing up.
I think
I will try to get more information on that. My mom would have a better perspective on it.
I'm still blown away that Mrs. Sledgehammer knows who Jeff and I are now.
Well, no, she does. I mean, we were talking, Don and Jeff, and we got to talking about the miniseries, and, she agrees with me that Sledgehammer was probably tougher than the way they portrayed him. But like the scene where they go hunting at the end,
yeah.
Okay, in 14, you just read China Marine, so they have Joe Mazzello just fold up and start crying like he couldn't even do it.
Nope.
The reality of it was, I mean, he shot 10 birds
with 10 shots.
Yeah, because my grandfather comes back and he's sitting on the running board of the car. "Oh, are you okay?" "Yeah, Dad, I just 10 for 10. I can't do it anymore."
Yeah. And Henry's connection's breaking up. On why it buffers out and comes back, I'll just let everybody know. Eugene used an old shotgun, and his grandfather's friends would say, "You need to get a newer one." The fact that you're using a shotgun is basically a center break 1-round shotgun. And so Eugene and his father would kind of play this knowing game that he thought it was unsportsman that these guys were just going out there plow, 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 and so he would line up a shot and he would only squeeze off the one. And so for him, his dad, to him it was how many buckshots did I use? And so, as Henry just said before his internet cracked up, he actually went out, shot 10, only used 10 rounds, and it was when he saw the life leaving, as he greatly describes in China Marine, the brown eye of that dove. That's when he went back and said, I can't do this anymore. But as Henry's going to tell you right now, that was not his last hunting excursion. He went out on one more.
I don't know if we talked about this, Don. Do you have me okay? You got a good signal?
No, you're good now.
Okay. I do remember him telling me, because I briefly got into deer hunting back when I was in my 20s, and I was more into just going out in the woods and shooting a gun at throwing a stick in the river and shooting at that. I enjoyed that more than hunting. But he thought it was great that I wanted to hunt. He fully supported that. But he and my grandfather went deer hunting one time down on the Alabama River with some friends. And, I remember my dad telling me that he was in a stand right there by the Alabama River. And they were running dogs, and he heard the deer crashing through the woods. And this young 4-point just stopped. I mean, really close to him. And, my dad said, I was standing there. I could have taken that thing out and he would have never known what hit him. And he said, I stepped out and I whistled at him and did my hands like that, and he took off. He said, I had no desire. That was like ambush. I mean, he said, I had no desire to kill that thing. And then everybody else came up, oh, Eugene, man, that thing it had to come right by you. And he said, yeah, I didn't see it. I don't know.
In the book, he was saying earlier that trip, he actually shot one with a shotgun. And he told the property owner, there's no sport in that. You can't miss with a shotgun. And so when the guys went out for the second round, the property owner took him down in the story and gave him a rifle. And so your dad sat down there with a rifle because he felt it was more sporting. But then he saw the majesty of it, and he had no interest. And so he actually did bag one earlier that day. But that was his last, after seeing that buck and the does in the river. No interest.
Can I share an anecdote with you?
Please.
I remember sitting in my dad's study, when I was a kid, did it many times, and just talking to him about this stuff. And, he was a biologist. Everybody in Montevallo knew the depth of his scientific knowledge. They knew that his specialty was birds, okay, the study of birds. And if a bird flew into somebody's plate glass window and got hurt or something, they would bring it to my dad. And I can remember, and I'm juxtaposing something here in his character, but I can remember a young baby bird somebody had brought him, and this thing was pretty bashed up. It wasn't going to survive. And he was holding it in his hand, and he held it in his hand when it died. And he said, I'm just trying to keep it warm, because it's not going to make it. I can tell there's no way. And so we sat there with it, and the little bird expired. And my father was really compassionate in that way. Now, skip ahead to another time. We were sitting in his study, and I remember we were talking about his World War II experience. And I asked him, I said, Dad, how many Japanese soldiers do you think you killed? And, he looked out the window and he said, well, the 60 millimeter mortar was pretty effective weapon. But he said, I know what you're asking me. And he thought about it for a minute, and I'm not going to say what he said. I'm going to keep that between him and me. But, just the matter of fact, and he did, it's not something he bragged about or was proud of. It was his job. That's what they were there for. But, he could matter-of-factly answer that question, completely devoid of any emotion.
Next one comes from William. So he loved the episode last week. Question he had is, did your family, actually that's not the one I didn't want to read that one yet. Here we go. Ron. Good afternoon, Mr. Sledge. Quick question. Did you ever have the opportunity to meet Snafu growing up? Did he ever come to your house and visit your father, or did you ever see him at any of the reunions that your dad went to? Just wondering. it was sad to see how they didn't get a chance to say goodbye on the last scene of the miniseries. Thanks, Ron.
I did meet Snafu in 1984. I came home, I grew up in Montevallo, and I graduated from Auburn University. But before I went to Auburn, I did go to Montevallo for a couple of years. And I can remember I came home one day from class, and I walk in the living room, and I see this short, stocky guy sitting there with his wife. And I knew who Snafu was. I mean, I literally grew up hearing the name Snafu. It just, imagine conversations you've had with each of you, with your dads, things they would say. I heard the name Snafu all my life. And we even thought about naming a dog that one time, but we didn't. But, I walk in and my dad's like, Henry, this is Snafu. This is my son, Henry. Henry, this is Snafu. I knew immediately who he was. And, hey, you doing? It's good to meet you. I mean, your daddy and me are good friends, and it was cool to meet him. In 1984, I was 21 years old. I was a college kid. I had other things on my mind, but I look back on it and I wish I'd spent more time in the room with him.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But I felt like, hey, I'm home from college. The adults are trying to do their thing. I shook his hand and, looked him in the eye and told him what a pleasure it was to meet him. And then I made myself scarce. And I look back and, man, I wish I'd stayed in that room longer. Yeah. But yes, I did meet him, and I certainly all my life knew who Snafu was, and would love to meet a member of his family. I mean, my dad I heard some of these stories about Snafu.
I can imagine. Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear from his family how they felt about their father's representation in that miniseries. Because
I think they were very happy. I think, yeah. I would hate to be proven wrong on that. I think they were. But he has family to this day in the Louisiana, somewhere in Louisiana. But I've not had the pleasure of meeting any of them.
The email I started reading from William says, I just had a question for Mr. Sledge. Did your family get invited out to the HBO red carpet premiere if they had one for the miniseries, or did you guys just watch it on HBO like the rest of us?
There were a number of premieres. When I say we, my mother and I, because my brother really didn't want to go, we flew out to Hollywood to go to the Hollywood premiere. That's where I met Tom Hanks for the first time. And then they had a premiere in New Orleans at the World War II Museum, and we went to that premiere. So the answer to the question is yes.
Very cool. This one, I think, maybe gets into the controversy or the topic of the HPT hat, the Marine Corps versus the Army. Brandon Mallory seems to know a lot about the subject. Great podcast, guys. Regarding the types of the Army/USMC caps, aka covers, here are pictures as way of clarification. The cover without the EGA on the front was used by the Army and Marines personnel alike, and is technically an Army 1941 pattern HPT cap. The round dome HPT cover is actually an Army Air Corps mechanic's hat, because I accidentally said that the Army seemed more round like a ball cap, and he sent a picture of the baseball cap style. That's not what I meant, but that was on me. Let's see. The rounded dome hat HPT cover is actually an Army Air Corps mechanic's hat. The HPT cover with the EGA on the front is a P-44, the 1944 pattern P-44 Marine cover, and from photographic evidence was used as early as Iwo Jima and Okinawa. E.B. Sledge's cover is the M1941 Army pattern. Now, obviously, I don't have any originals, and I know you have your father's, and maybe you can look on it at some point. To me, you can't really look at the color, because the color, to me, I always just thought that the Marine Corps one was made from the same material as their sage green uniforms, but I guess not. Obviously, mine's sweatier, and of course, these are from two different manufacturers, but I just assumed that they all had a shorter bill, whereas the Army has a longer bill. But if you look at on yours, now this may be something they change when they start putting the EGA on it. The seam is not in the front. The one is your father's. Is there a stitching seam, dead nuts in the center? Yes. So it was more similar to the Army, whereas in the later year they offset it so they could put the silk screen on there, because on the P-44s, the stitching is actually not centered, it's offset. But I don't know. I guess I'm wrong, but so Jeff was right. They were the same. But to me,
I mean, I wasn't going to point that out or anything.
No, I
thought
I'm the first one to admit I was wrong, and maybe it's the manufacturers who make the reproductions that make them out of the same material as the P-41s, but I just assumed that they were Marine Corps hats made from the same HBT sage green as the P-41 uniforms. Apparently not. Apparently in real life they would have been closer to this color, made from, I guess.
Wasn't the HBT weave different from on the Army versus the Marine?
Yes, that's why it was referred to as herringbone twill, and you can really see it on some of those episodes in HD. You can see that herringbone pattern. If you think of herringbone like the gold necklaces, they almost look like up and down chevrons. And so when you look at a new one, you can definitely see the herringbone, and they were technically sage green, whereas the Armies were OD5 or OD7, whatever the OD number code was. And so technically there was a difference in color. But we are getting ready to wrap up this week's show. I want to thank everybody else. Here's one more from Steve. Let's see here. In China Marine, your father referred to a friend of his that he shared a foxhole with throughout Okinawa throughout Okinawa, and this friend suffered from alcoholism while serving in China. He referred to him as Pete. He said that Pete got so much trouble from being drunk and assaulting MPs that he was in the brig when the rest of them were getting sent home. Did your father ever reveal to you who Pete actually was?
You know, that was in China Marine.
Yeah, he makes it known that Pete was not his name. He was obviously protecting his identity.
That is a good question. I got to reread China Marine. It's been a long time since I've read it. It's possible that my dad and I talked about that. I will tell you this, and I'm sorry I can't give a better answer to that question. But this afternoon when my mother and I were talking, and this is, I mean, look, man, the world owes a debt of gratitude to my dad's wife, because to my mom, because number one, she's the one who suggested he publish the book, which we talked about that last week. But I didn't remember this, but my mom said, there were, like anybody, I mean, you serve with a bunch of guys. There are going to be people who acquit themselves well, and then people who maybe don't. They break and run under fire, or they crack up, whatever. And my dad talked about some of those things. I didn't know this. My mom said he had wanted to, he used everybody's real name unless he said otherwise, like in the case of Pete in China Marine. She said he wanted to use everybody's real name regardless.
Yeah.
And she was the one who said, well, hold on now. Let's not, these people have families. They, people are going to read this book. They're going to know, and so he acquiesced to her wishes, and very wisely so. But I'm sorry I can't give a better answer to the question of Pete, but I do know that I think there was a lieutenant that he called Shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And, I remember my dad talking about that guy, and, I think it was, my mom felt very strongly that he should not use real names in the case of people who were not going to be spoken of in the best of terms.
I think someone may have made that same suggestion to Robert Leckie, because he used a lot of guys' names, but there was one lieutenant he strictly referred to as Lieutenant Spearmint, like the gum, because he did not speak of him fondly. And I think someone, or maybe he thought of himself, but yeah, there's definitely a few people in A Helmet for My Pillow that he protected because they weren't being portrayed very well by giving them nicknames. And they were nicknames used, but at no point in that book were their real names published. We're going to wind down this episode. I want to thank everybody once again for hanging out with us, and Henry, you coming back. And once again, head over to WTSPWorldWar2.com when this episode airs, and we'll send you guys a link for the We the Happy Few, the 506, because as Henry said, they're going to do a crossover episode referring to HBO The Pacific, and he's going to be joining in on that. And Jeff, you have any final words for anybody?
Yeah, well, first I want to thank Henry again. I look forward to talking to him again. Now that I've got your contact information, don't think I won't be reaching out because I've still got a
Yeah,
million
please do.
questions.
Yeah, poor Henry.
Yeah.
I text him like at 11 o'clock at night.
We'll be friends for life. I know that. I don't know if I should reveal too much about some of the future episodes, but I think Henry would appreciate this.
Mm-hmm.
I was reached out to, and I've told Don, I was reached out to somebody who's asking to have Don and I on his podcast. And I think Henry, he mentioned that he's got you booked for sometime in October.
Yep.
He's a retired lieutenant colonel, but he also gave me, he's a Marine lieutenant colonel. He also gave me the contact information, and I've since messaged this gentleman who apparently worked for Mr. Dale Dye on the Pacific as, I guess, one of the guys that ran the boot camp for the actors, and reached out to him and sounded. He said he'd be honored to be on What's the Scuttlebutt with us. So that's pretty exciting stuff coming up much later. But my final thought is, Henry, again. Thanks for everything that you've shared with us, and I look forward to growing our relationship. And I hope to really meet you one day. And please give your best to your mother.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I will.
Both of us.
I hope this isn't the last time, guys.
No, our door is always open. We'll have you on anytime, whether it's to promote
Totally
new
enjoyed it.
events.
I love ETO stuff too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, you and I were talking the other day that, Jeff and I would be happy to have you on to talk about things completely not based on, the Pacific or your father, just sharing World War II knowledge altogether. But
yes, I'd love it.
Yes, definitely give your best to your mom. And that is going to wrap it up for this episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on the live stream. Please, as Jeff and I said, word of mouth is huge. Please share us with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, if any of you guys are still on there, because, well, we won't get into that, but any of the media outlets or even the old-fashioned email, just send a link to our show to your friends, and please get the word out. And if you're on iTunes or any of those podcast apps that allow you to give a review, please give us a good review and share us, because the more reviews we have, the more likely Apple will share us with other people who listen to other educational podcasts and all that good stuff. On the behalf of Jeff Copsetta and Mr. Henry Sledge, my name is Don Abernathy, and we thank you guys so much for joining us, and we will talk to you all very soon.
This has been a Digital 410 production.